Okay, so our next speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Manoj Lalu to the stage, to the front of the room. So Manoj has come from the University of Ottawa, and he was with us in RCSI yesterday for a brilliant talk with our tissue engineering research group. So I'm really looking forward to your talk today. So Manoj is an anesthesiologist from the Ottawa Hospital, a scientist at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and an associate professor in the University of Ottawa's Department of Anesthesiology and Pain Medicine. He co-leads the Blueprint Translational Research Group in Ottawa, which is focused on improving the preclinical to clinical translational pathway. It includes preclinical and clinical systematic reviews, meta research on conducting and reporting of lab-based studies and patient engagement. Professor Lalu leads LabPartners, which is an excellent website, and he'll be speaking a bit more about that. It's an initiative focused on championing preclinical patient engagement. And I should just highlight, so Manoj from Canada, they use the term patient engagement, and I know Ingrid and Beck mentioned about all the different terms that we use. So in this context, we're talking about patient engagement as PPI. His wet lab investigates sepsis and lung injury using murine models, and he's also a member of the Centre of Journalology with special interest in predatory journals. So Manoj, I'm delighted to hear your talk, and we have time for questions afterwards as well.
Thanks, Ian, for the introduction. Just start my timer here so I keep it to 20 minutes. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing around LabPartners and trying to, I guess, synchronize, as the title says, their perspectives between researchers and preclinical researchers and patients. It's a meme on the right-hand side. One of our grad students modified it, so we have our researchers thinking they're doing some brilliant work and from their perspective, and then you have the patients on the other side having quite a different perspective of the same product, right? So we're trying to synchronize that so everyone has the same positive perspective in the end. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit of a story, first of all. If there's an origin story for LabPartners, this is it. So back in 2019, this is before the pandemic, Sepsis Canada brought together a group of preclinical researchers from across Canada. We're all interested in studying, as Niamh mentioned, murine or mouse models of sepsis. And I should mention for sepsis, what we're talking about there is life-threatening infections. So sepsis can often lead patients to be in the intensive care unit on life support as well too. So very serious health condition. But we studied it in the lab using mouse models. We all came together. There were researchers, clinicians, trialists, and trainees that all came together for this meeting to actually discuss how we could do something called a multi-laboratory study. So just as you've probably heard of multi-center clinical trials, we're trying to do the same thing in the lab with mouse models. And when we're putting this meeting together, I was in charge of that. One of the heads of Sepsis Canada said, hey, we need a patient partner at the table too. And this is a couple of weeks out from the meeting. I said, well, we're not quite prepared for that. We're talking about mouse models here, haven't really talked about it. And she thought that I could do it because we had been quite successful at that point in clinical patient engagement and clinical trials. And she said, well, no, we need it. We need it because the funder needs to see that we have a patient at the table. So terrible setup. I'm sure everyone in the room here can agree. A bit tokenistic as well too. But we were very lucky because we actually were able to find one person, Catherine Hendrick, who, I'll see if I can, see my pointer here, because I'd like to point her out. You'll see a picture of her again anyways, but it is right there. Is my cursor working on that screen as well too? Okay, so you can see Catherine. You'll see another picture of her as well too. So she was actually the president of the Canadian Sepsis Foundation, so an advocacy group to raise awareness for sepsis nationally. And she said, okay, yeah, sure, I'll come. So she came to this meeting, actually a beautiful location, Niagara on the Lake, so at least she had that. We talked the whole day about mouse models of sepsis, and at the end of the day, having dinner, Catherine and I are talking, she goes, I don't know what I was doing at this meeting. And I said, I don't know either. So it was a bit of a frank and honest discussion, but we actually both saw the opportunity there as well too. And that's actually led to a very, very successful research program, LabPartners, which I'll tell you about a little bit more, where we're really focusing on refining and optimizing how we can bring preclinical researchers together with patient partners. And I should mention, I should have started with this. When I'm talking about preclinical, what am I talking about? I'm talking about research that is conducted in laboratories, usually with animal models and cell models as well too. And when we're talking about preclinical, a a lot of preclinical researchers will distinguish themselves from basic scientists as well too, because often preclinical researchers are trying to think about the downstream translation and how what they're doing in cells and animal models might be translated to the bedside to patients as well too. So a little bit of background on when we talk about preclinical, what we actually mean. And it's a really interesting word because just like patient engagement or PPI, there's so many people talking about the same different thing, but we use different terms, unfortunately. So our LabPartners team, just a quick introduction to them. On the very bottom, I'll just put our patient partners, Dawn Richards. She's actually a patient partner and she's a co-lead investigator of the LabPartners program. We also have Patrick Sullivan and Catherine on the top row there again, and Pat Messner on the very end of the top row there. So there are patient partners. Just to mention that everything I'll be speaking about here has been co-created and co-built with patient partners as well too. So over the next 15 plus minutes, I'm going to quickly go through what we mean by preclinical patient engagement. I'll show you what we're doing in terms of creating resources around preclinical engagement, and I'll give you one case example of what preclinical patient engagement could look like as well too. So preclinical versus clinical patient engagement, and again, just to reiterate, and you've already mentioned this, patient engagement is the term we use in Canada, so it's ingrained in my mind, but it's exactly what everyone in this room means when you're talking about PPI, basically. It's the same thing. So what are the differences between preclinical research and clinical research when it comes to patient engagement? So number one, I would say the location is quite different. I think some of you might be familiar with what a laboratory looks like. It is a very, very different setting from the clinical setting or the hospital setting or the clinic setting that many of us are used to and many patient partners are used to. I know in our institution, it's behind actual security doors and locked doors. You can't get in there without passes. And you can't even set foot in the labs unless you've done many learning modules, unfortunately, and in-person, hands-on training as well. So there's this location difference. I think the backgrounds are different as well too. Preclinical researchers, I think, are a little bit further away from our patient partners and the conversations that they're used to having around research. And that really plays into this language difference as well too. And of course, that language difference exists also in clinical patient engagement, we all know that. However, I'd say it's even just a little bit further apart when you're talking about preclinical researchers and they're speaking about, again, often mouse models or animal models or cell models of a health condition and our patient partners on the other side. So need to have a bit more of a discourse on creating a common language. And then finally, training, I'd say it's quite different. Many people who are involved in clinical research have had some training. I know as myself as an anesthesiologist, we have training to basically interact and speak with people from all different walks of life. I would suggest that preclinical researchers don't necessarily have that training, right? So again, there's a bit of a training difference there as well. However, with all that being said, our group and others believe that patient engagement in preclinical research is important. We think we have the opportunity here to align research priorities very early in that translational pipeline with the downstream priorities of patients and the public as well too. Ultimately, we think with that better alignment, we might be able to reduce research waste. And what we've seen, even firsthand, is it really fosters bi-directional learning between researchers and patient partners. I think there's exciting opportunities that exist there. And then also researcher motivation. And I can actually speak from my own personal experience. Before I did or entered into medicine, I actually completed my PhD in the lab. So I actually studied sepsis in rat and mouse models. And throughout those 4+ years of studying sepsis, day in, day out, many weekends as well too, I never met a single person or interacted with a single person who had a lived experience of sepsis, which is a little bit bizarre when you think about it, right? So you dedicate your whole life to studying a health condition, but you never get that opportunity to interact. So luckily that's changed. So everyone in my lab, for instance, all our trainees, they get the opportunity to interact with we have a patient panel, all of whom have had some sort of lived experience with sepsis. And talking to them and talking to other labs where they've done similar, they say that these trainees are saying, well, this is so great. I come in every day, 75% of what I do in the lab doesn't work. and this is just the way a lot of preclinical lab research actually works. There's lots of failure there, and it's very frustrating. And often you're thinking, well, what am I doing with my life? But then having this conversation and understanding what that health condition is like helps them refocus, and again increases their motivation to continue on with what they're doing. So I thought I'd dive into a little bit about what LabPartners has been doing on the research side of things. One of the first things that we did was actually a scoping review of preclinical patient engagement. So we looked in published literature, as well we looked on the web to see if we could see any examples of preclinical patient engagement. At the time that we did that, which is about 5 years ago now, we found 32 examples. So not a whole lot, but I will say a couple of caveats to that. Number one, there are undoubtedly many other examples of preclinical patient engagement where they simply didn't disseminate it in some form or other, so we just weren't able to find out about it. And then also we know since that time there's been many more examples. So I think this area is growing very quickly. But of those 32 that we found, we were still actually pretty impressed with what we saw there in terms of health conditions that were being studied. We had genetic health conditions and musculoskeletal health conditions. You might be asking, where did these researchers and patient partners actually come together? They met each other often through patient organizations, so advocacy organizations. And then in terms of who was being engaged in these projects, 20 of these studies, engaged patients themselves, so people with lived experience, and then 7 of them actually engaged caregivers. So there's some pediatric health conditions, for instance, so parents were involved. The remaining were some combination of both. In terms of level of engagement, this was really interesting as well too. So I think many of you in the room here are familiar with the IAP2, or the International Association for Public Participation scale of patient engagement or patient-public engagement. So it goes from inform in the blue, just trying to find my cursor here, but all right, we can read here. So there's inform there in the blue, and that basically means, okay, what's going on in our lab? And it goes all the way to empower, where the patient partners are actually making decisions. We added another category, a 6th one for awareness, and this was largely where basic scientists were going to advocacy organizations and telling them a little bit more about the molecular aspects of whatever health condition was of interest. But we were really interested because there was actually examples across that spectrum, which is great. And we even had examples of Empower where there were steering committees that were led by patient partners, and they had the ultimate decision-making power as to what would be funded or not, which is interesting and exciting. In terms of the stages that patient partners contributed to this preclinical research, we have funding off to the left to the dissemination of results. There's that whole education piece as well too. You can see examples that basically carry through the whole research cycle there. It adds up to more than 32 because many of these examples actually had basically involved patients in more than one stage. What we see zeros for, which is sort of interesting and very different from the clinical research world, is data analysis and data collection as well too. And perhaps that's not surprising because, again, that lab environment is very different. Access is it's difficult, I should say, perhaps more difficult than the clinical research world. So we haven't seen any yet. There is some interest from one of our patient partners on one of our patient panels to do this. So we're going to try to explore this in the new year a little bit, but we'll report back to everyone. But I think that's one area where there hasn't been much, but I think there's been very important contributions nevertheless in these other areas of research. So we then went on to conduct an interview study where we interviewed the researchers who had published these studies where there's patient engagement involved. And we also interviewed some of the patient partners that were involved in these projects as well too. And we boiled down the results of our interview study into these 5 ingredients for successful preclinical patient engagement. We haven't published this paper yet, it's in preparation. But number one, we need a shift in scientific culture. So I thought it was really interesting. Some of the earlier speakers are talking about still the need for the shift in scientific culture, but I'd say there's even a larger shift that's necessary in the preclinical research world. I would suggest that patient engagement is becoming ingrained in clinical research. However, I think we're a bit further off from that in preclinical research. I think part of it comes down to understanding the value of patient engagement. So we still need to convince people I'd say more so in the preclinical world and the clinical world, that this is important and we could do important things if we just simply engage our end users, right, into this whole process. Number three, I think we need to take a thoughtful and tailored approach. So simply slapping on what we've done in terms of frameworks and our approaches that have worked really well, I'd say, in clinical patient engagement, and trying to put that onto the preclinical world, I don't think will work because of some of the differences I've already pointed out. We need a clear and common vocabulary or language. So I've already spoken to some of the differences that exist. And also, I think we need to think about the varied aims and motivations for patient engagement. So within clinical research, some of our trialists, they want patient engagement because they know there's actually quantitative evidence that we can actually improve our recruitment and retainment of participants in trials if there's patient engagement within the development of the trial itself. So what are the biosimilars to that within the preclinical world? I mean, to think about that, right? And I think every single research group is going to be a little bit different as to why they would want to have patient engagement or how that might improve what they're doing in the lab. I also wanted to point out some excellent work that's been done locally here as well too, led by Michelle Flood's group, and I think Podrick is first author of this as well too. So I was highlighting another paper yesterday, so he's in the back here. So this was an interview study where they were interviewing patients in public in terms of their perspectives on preclinical spinal cord research. And what's really interesting here is that they picked up many of the same themes that we had and I've already discussed here, which is appreciating the benefits despite the knowledge gaps. They found that informed perspectives of people living with spinal cord injury can improve preclinical research relevance. And then third, barriers, accessibility issues. I already talked about that. Lab environment's quite different. And also, many people with spinal cord injury are also have mobility issues, so they're in wheelchairs. So you can think that, not very many labs, I would say, are accessible completely to people in wheelchairs. And facilitators, personal contact and dialogue. So I think that rings through both in clinical patient engagement and in preclinical patient engagement. Other work that we're continuing on, and this is work that we're, at least this slide is work that we've actually completed over the last couple of years now. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we're planning over the next 2 years as well. So we've started to develop a process framework for preclinical patient engagement. It builds off much of the success that has occurred in clinical patient engagement, but we're also recognizing many of the differences that do exist. So we've put together a group that includes preclinical researchers, patient partners, and other collaborators and interest holders. And we've had a series of meetings where we talked about, what are these ingredients that will make preclinical patient engagement successful? And we've come up then with a framework which includes these components. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically, if you want to think about it, almost like a protocol. And I say protocol because preclinical researchers love protocols. Everything we do in the lab is based on protocols. So this is a bit of a protocol on preclinical patient engagement. And we're hoping to build a resource where preclinical researchers and interested patient partners could go to this and say, okay, how could we make this work around our lab research? But introducing what patient engagement is, who can be involved, what stages can people be involved. We're going to have case studies and other resources there to make sure or do as best a job we can to ensure that that preclinical patient engagement is successful. Next steps, and we're hoping that maybe some of the folks in the room here might be interested in some of these next steps. We're actually putting together an international consensus building survey, a Delphi survey for some of you that might be familiar with that term. It's several rounds where we're going to have different interest holders vote on what we've put together for the framework. We're looking for lots of feedback as well. We're open to that. And we're going to go through several rounds to basically refine that framework further with international input. I should mention here that Dr. Michelle Flood is actually on our international advisory board as well for this. So we've put together an international advisory board who's also provided a lot of input to make sure that our framework is well informed. So we're looking for people to provide feedback on the draft framework, participate in the Delphi, and Explorer one-stop website, which I'll show next. And I should mention, I forgot to mention the last point on the very bottom of the left-hand side there, which is that we're actually pilot testing this framework with 10 different groups. These are laboratory researchers, largely in Canada. There might be an opportunity for, if there is some interest in Ireland, to have another group as well too, where we're basically pairing our research teams with patient partners, a bit of a forced marriage. And then we're going to see how that all works out with a draft framework and what comes out of it at the end of 3 sessions, which are going to be facilitated as well. So our website, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's labpartners.ca, so not .com, but .ca. And this is what you'll come to on the homepage there. We have resources for different interest holders. So if you're a researcher, you can press that tab there. If you're a patient partner, you can press the middle tab. If you're an organization looking to support preclinical patient engagement, you can press that tab as well too. And what I'll say here is that we're just beginning to populate this whole website. There's lots of stuff already there, but I think we're going to be refining that and optimizing that over the next couple of years as well too. And if there's anyone in this room here who'd like to contribute to that website with your resources or have us point to your organizations, totally happy to do that as well too. In fact, we're encouraging it. So I'm just going to check my time here. I'll finish off with a case study here, and this is actually finishing off with where we began, which is our National Preclinical Sepsis Platform. So we're several years into it now. There's 6 labs from across the country where we're all coming together to do this multi-laboratory study. And through all of this, we've actually had our patient panel. So Catherine is right, third person from the top there, and she stuck with us. So she didn't run away after that first meeting, which is great. And we also have Sahar, Marie Maxime, and Laurie Prue also involved. And in terms of a concrete example of what they've done, well, they've actually attended, or we've at least invited them to every one of our monthly meetings. These are national meetings that occur virtually, and we talk about basically putting together this multi-laboratory study. So they provided input in the background and participated in those meetings. And in one of those meetings, we were talking about some of the biomarkers that we were interested in looking at in this mouse model. And several of our patient partners said, okay, that's great, but what about the things that we were hearing about when we were in the unit or when our loved one was in the intensive care unit? For instance, blood gases. And we thought, okay, well, actually, that's a great idea. Blood gases and arterial blood gases are very relevant clinical measures. So that prompted us to actually buy blood analysis devices for all of the 6 labs, and we're now measuring that in our murine mouse model as well too, in our final experiments that we're doing. So I think a very firm example of how they've influenced and changed what we've done in the lab. I'll give almost last word to Catherine. I have a summary slide right after this. But she says, when I first joined the NPSP, or the National Preclinical Sepsis Platform, and that was that meeting in 2019, I wasn't sure how my experience as a caregiver could contribute to preclinical research, especially in animal studies. But I've come to see that patients and caregivers bring a unique value. We ensure that research is grounded in what truly happens in the lives of those affected by sepsis. So I think that's a great statement by Catherine and shows how far we've come in those last few years. So just to summarize, I do think that engaging patients as partners in preclinical laboratory research is feasible. I have many more case examples, we just don't have time. So and if anyone wants to ask me, I can certainly go through a couple of those. And I think it's feasible, and I think it offers some unique benefits as well too. I think it requires out-of-the-box thinking, preparation, resources, and also a collaborative approach. And then finally, I'd point you to LabPartners.ca, our website, where you can learn a bit more about preclinical patient engagement, or if you or your organizations are interested in it, you can certainly reach out to me. My email is there on the slide, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
I'll keep you here, Manoj.
Oh,
That's
okay, sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
So we do
yeah.
have a couple of minutes for questions, if anyone wants any. Yeah, hi, Emma.
Thank you. As a lot of people know, this is my area of love as well, and how I came into this field. I just wanted to ask you something that's come up a lot to me is, and it's related to EDI as well. A lot of preclinical researchers have gone into it because they can be in the lab away from people.
Yeah.
So there is that issue around when we open it up much more widely.
Yeah.
Yes, it builds their skills, but for some of them, it has been an active part of the choice in their career, is that they've chosen something away from it. So how do we help support them without terrifying them?
And I mean, from your experience, has it been more of the senior scientists that you've encountered with that attitude, or more of the trainees and junior scientists?
Like it's a bit of a mix, you
Okay.
know, and I would do a lot of work with data scientists as well.
Okay.
You
Yeah, I
know,
wasn't thinking about them. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a mix. And usually, what I say is, you don't have to talk, but you have to be there and listen.
Yeah.
But getting them to that place, you know, it requires a lot of skills that they don't have.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because the reason I asked that question, because I've certainly encountered that, but it's been almost exclusively with very senior scientists. We see quite the opposite with the trainees. So I think some of the work that we heard about earlier today is brilliant. It's great in terms of just, you don't even have to involve the principal, the senior investigators, right? You just have the PhD students alone, right? And so I think it's great. I think let's actually, generate some ideas on how we could bring that back, because that's actually been a bit of a barrier, I'd say, because the trainees are so excited, like, oh, I heard about this, and let me go back to my lab, and the principal, the senior investigators, like, oh no, we don't do that, right? So it's a bit disappointing, and I like your solution, which is that you don't have to necessarily actively participate, but you're in a team, you lead a team. Maybe other team members would be interested. That's certainly almost always been the case when I've run into a situation like that. And I love what you said, which is just be there to listen at the very least, and that might change your perspective, right? So.
I might actually move on to the panel now. if
Oh,
that's
sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Just